You can count when you're happy. 1, 2, 3, 4. You can count when you're sad. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or count when you're frightened. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Count when you're mad. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Counting is wonderful. Counting is marvelous. Counting's terrific. And how?
The episode opens with Clark doing something he knows his father doesn't want him to. Last time it was football, this time it's buying a class ring. I guess if he's going to defy his father's wishes about one high school cliche, he might as well do it with this one too. The ring changes his personality, making him more confident, impulsive, gives him a big problem with authority and the gall to hit on and ask out whatever girl he's most into at the time, and sometimes even more than one at once. It's sure a good thing these rings didn't come out the day he found out about his heat vision. He finally tells Lana how he feels about her and comes very near to telling her about his powers, but she gets fed up with his obnoxious hothead biker punk attitude, and when he starts kissing the new girl from Smallville high in front of her, that's her last straw. Conveniently, of course, this means the inevitable guest star of the week, Jesse, gets to see Clark use his powers, and Lana doesn't. Doesn't take Pete and Clark's parents very long to realize something is seriously wrong with Clark, as obvious as this is, regardless of whether or not you know he's got superpowers. Lana apparently ignores it because she's in love with him and is hoping he'll give her the truth, all the way up until he asks her to a bar and says, "There's plenty of me to go around." Clark starts talking about being sick of being poor and how he can use his powers to gain fame and fortune. He buys video games and expensive clothes and what he calls all the cool stuff everyone else has with his parents' credit cards. And when they don't like it, he steals Jonathan's newly refurbished motorcycle and runs away from home. By the end, he hides out at the Luthor mansion, wanting to live more like Lex. After Lana rejects him, he plans to run away with Jesse and make millions with his powers. Clark finds out Jesse and her dad are on the run because he has some discs with evidence of fraud and corporate espionage that could put a lot of people out of business, and a federal marshal wants to get his hands on it because he knows someone who will pay $1 million for it. When Clark finds out, he changes his plans and goes after Jesse and her father to get the discs himself. Chloe, thinking the class rings are fake from the beginning, discovers they're made not of ruby, but of red meteor rock, firmly establishing Clark as the replacement for the Kryptofreak for this episode. Pete tells Jonathan about the red rocks, who, after trying to reason with Clark and failing, ultimately decides they'll have to go to the furthest degree to snap him out of it, green kryptonite. It's nice, by the way, to see Pete's new knowledge of Clark's powers being relevant again in just the next episode. Finally, this guy has a real purpose. Lex tells Jonathan that Clark is at the mansion, and somehow or rather that's enough for Jonathan and Pete to find Clark out in the cornfield chasing Jesse, and without Lex, for no conceivable reason other than Lex doesn't know about green meteor rock and the show needs to keep it that way. Pete uses green kryptonite on Clark, and Jonathan hits the red ring with a sledgehammer. Clark apologizes for everything, and happily he remembers it all, which is rare when it comes to these I'm Not Myself episodes, and says he didn't mean anything he did or says, but Jonathan says those feelings must have come from somewhere. During all this, there's a short subplot where Lionel has been taking over the mansion and changing the layout of Lex's office to suit his own preferences. Lionel guilt trips him into letting him do it because of his blindness, but by the end, after dealing with Clark's rebellious streak, he comes to realize how unreasonable his father is being and finally tells him to stop feeling sorry for himself. Lionel, having met Clark at the mansion while he was on Red K, says that maybe he's learned how to be more direct from Clark, and this is the beginning of what will become Lionel's own ongoing fascination with and investigation of Clark. After he hears gunshots, which Clark shot into his own hand in front of him while dealing with the federal marshal, and Lionel is revealed to be holding the flat bullets in his hand at the end. The final scene is another tell me the truth or I'll walk off in a huff scene between Clark and Lana, this time not in the loft, but outside where Lana rides her horse. Clark, obviously unable to tell her why he acted the way he did, tries to say he wasn't himself, and Lana asks if he also means he wasn't himself when he told her he loved her. When he won't tell her the truth she's craved since the tornado, she rides off into the distance. Then credits. I've really got to hand it to this show for opening the second season with such a bang. We had a really solid conclusion to the cliffhanger, then Clark gets his heat vision, then Pete finds out about his powers, and now a semi-major comic book element, red kryptonite. I'm sure some fans didn't care for the idea of doing multicolored kryptonite in this show, but honestly, is it any hokier than having mountains of kryptonite all over the place and giving it virtually any properties a writer wants it to have so it can be responsible for every kind of superpower that's ever been written into a comic? Superman fans have long loathed kryptonite as an easy device to create conflict for an almost indestructible protagonist. When you're writing Superman, you really only have three choices. You can either A, constantly use villains that can beat Superman, making every every story a fight against a huge cosmic force, which becomes stale and unbelievable after a while. B, you can vary the kinds of conflict Superman faces and make much of the conflict internal. You still have external problems, but they're not as much about whether Superman can be hurt or killed, but more moral stories about whether Superman is using his extraordinary powers in the right way. That requires a lot of creative thinking, and those stories have to be really driven by the character, which is great when it works, but dull and uninteresting when it doesn't. Or C, you can just give your villains Superman's one weakness: Kryptonite. To be fair, Smallville does all three of these at various points and to varying degrees of success, but when 1 billion tons of Kryptonite are dropped on the town in the pilot so the writers can fall back on it when they don't have much of a story to tell, different colors were inevitable and, in my mind, almost welcome, when the alternative is just another Kryptofreak and Clark being weakened by Kryptonite. As much as I generally hate these stories about one of our characters acting out of character the whole episode, this is one of, if not the best of them. What sets it apart is two big things. First, Clark's unusual behavior is actually based on his personality and feelings he keeps buried, so it actually tells us about and develops his character somewhat. And secondly, he remembers everything that he does in the end. The episode also doesn't just waste a lot of time with scene after scene of Clark acting different while the audience is supposed to say, "Oh, isn't this fun?" We get to see him do things Clark would never do, and then that's all it's for. There are a lot of those episodes down the road. Red Kryptonite is used to explore the theme of teenage rebellion, and it also reinforces the idea that someone this powerful would be really dangerous without the right values and upbringing. Thankfully, this is another episode that brings that family drama aspect of the show to the forefront, which, as I've said before, is really what it does best and what the focus should primarily have always been. It raises a really interesting question, too. If Clark really did go off the deep end and decide to take full advantage of his abilities, what could his parents, or anyone else for that matter, really do to stop him? Jonathan and Martha set rules for him. They're stern when he disobeys. Clark clearly respects and can sometimes be intimidated by his father, but in reality, he doesn't really have to do anything anyone tells him to do. That was illustrated well in Leech, when Eric Summers pinned his father up against a wall and said, "What are you going to do, ground me?" And Clark's deeply hidden desires could have been really generic, but I actually buy them, and I buy that he hasn't really acted on them before. He was raised with a certain set of values, and although he sees what Lex has and there's a certain allure there for him, he also understands and appreciates why he doesn't have that himself, and knows that what his parents do give him is rare and not to be taken lightly. It was a good move to have the act of Clark putting on the red meteor ring a defiant act in itself. There's a consequence to Clark going against his father, almost a be careful what you wish for kind of message, and the fact that he sometimes will do things he knows he's not supposed to makes it more convincing that the outlandish things he does while on Red Kryptonite are because of feelings he actually has, rather than the ring just being a generic turns you evil device. And it's already been established numerous times, and was a major element last episode, that Clark doesn't like having to lie about his powers and wishes it wasn't necessary to hide them from his friends, so he has this urge to use powers in public and tell everyone about them while he's on Red Kryptonite. When Jonathan says at the end it was a close call, it really was. I like how Clark almost tells both Lana and Lex about his powers. He invites Lana to ask him anything, and since her arc this season has been all about being in love with Clark but refusing to act on that until she knows the truth about him, she asks what happened the day of the tornado, and he responds with, "We'll get there," confirming for her that she's right about him and he knows just what she's talking about. The episode definitely walks a line between not doing anything to hugely alter the status quo and still making the situation believable. You could question why he doesn't just tell her, since that's what she wants and he knows he'd get her if he told her, but I get the sense he wants to show off for her when he finally tells her, not that he's planning on keeping it a secret much longer. Keep in mind that when he's attacked at the bar, he starts using his powers right out in the open, setting a baseball bat on fire and tossing guys around, and that's seconds after Lana storms off. Considering Jesse's standing right there, I doubt he would have handled that any differently if Lana had stayed. So yeah, it's pretty convenient that if she had just stayed 3 more seconds, she would have known everything she wanted to know, but it's better than convenient unconsciousness or amnesia, which is what this show usually resorts to. And as with the best family-focused episodes, Lex has a story that parallels Clark's, but unusually, this one puts he and Clark in opposite roles. With Clark's Red K story, it's the son taking advantage of the father, while Lex is being taken advantage of by his father, Lionel. Clark and Lionel both dislike their situations and rebel, and both are in the wrong. Jonathan repeatedly puts his foot down, and even follows Clark to school and gets thrown up against a truck. His son is more powerful than he is, but does his best not to back down. Lionel is more powerful than Lex, too, but Lex learns from watching the Kents that he has to stand his ground. At the end, when Lex finally tells his father, "Stop acting like your blindness gives you an excuse for self-pity," Lionel responds with, "So the son becomes the father." And by the way, I often roll my eyes at famous Superman lines thrown in for obvious foreshadowing, but I can get behind this one. It fits the scene and means something if you don't remember Marlon Brando's Jor-El's line from the first Superman film. I like that Lionel first credits the way he raised Lex and then wonders if it's because of Clark, who he's just met, and I love the way they meet, by the way. It's great to see Lex looking at the Kents and using something he's learned from them, rather than just brooding about his family not being enough like Clark's. Putting Clark and Lionel in a similar role is surprising and creative. Jeff Loeb wrote this episode and does a few pretty hackneyed things plot-wise, but his dialogue is pretty solid. Lex has one of my favorite lines when he tells Clark, "I wasn't aware that a $2,000 coat came with a backbone." Once again, for the umpteenth time, we've got a homicidal bad guy who kills someone in the teaser just so the show can look edgy. This plot about a corporate whistleblower with a disc that can send a lot of people to jail is really shoehorned in here, explained ridiculously fast by the federal marshal to Clark in the final act, and it's less of an intriguing plot and really just a trite excuse for Clark to use his powers in front of someone because, on Red K, he desperately wants to do that. But the show's plan needs him to not show any more of our regulars right now. It's pretty convenient that the school rings come at exactly the same time as this new girl shows up to school, and it's just so Clark can act like a jerk with two girls fighting over him. At the same time, I'm glad the two girls weren't Chloe and Lana, because I'm ready for Chloe to move on and stop it with the love triangle face. This would have been a different plot, and I realized that part of the idea is for Clark to go as far as almost becoming a criminal, that the ease of getting money with his powers does appeal to some part of him. But having these guest stars would have been more natural if they were somehow tied into Clark getting on Red K at the beginning. Also pretty convenient is that Jonathan just happens to be fixing up his motorcycle just when Clark turns into a punk who would look really rad on a motorcycle. And as I said in the synopsis, I don't know how Jonathan and Pete find Clark in the cornfield or how Jonathan got rid of Lex. That's some pretty sloppy plotting going on. I like the idea of Lionel trying to bully Lex and take over his domain, but I have to question his changing the layout of Lex's office. Why would a blind man care what the place looked like? I can get moving the pool table out for noise reasons and such, but he has a digital sign with stock numbers scrolling across it. What? He can't read it. There's a lot of people not noticing things happening right in front of their faces. Clark and Lana make out pretty explicitly in the Talon, Lana's workplace, in front of her customers, some of whom have been waiting for their orders since Clark stopped her and keeps grabbing her tray away from her when she's trying to work. How does nobody say anything about that? And when Clark throws his father up against his truck so hard that it dents it and the door closes, none of the dozens of kids standing there seem to notice except for Pete. How is Clark not getting investigated by the police and getting either suspended or expelled from school for this? And questions to ask Jor-El when I get to heaven. What are Jonathan and Martha's credit card limit? I have a hard time believing such a fiscally responsible family would have a large enough line of credit that Clark can buy everything he buys. Lex says his black coat costs $2,000. He buys a TV, a stereo, his loft is filled with stuff. It seems like he spent several $1,000s. I don't know if the Kents have any debt, but they don't strike me as the kind of people that would end up with a lot of credit card debt. And as modestly as they live, if they pay their cards off at the end of the month, it doesn't make much sense, even if their credit is good enough to get companies to give them that much, that they would want a huge line of credit. And now let's go to the scoreboard. We kind of have a Kryptofreak with Clark, but I'm not going to count it because my definition of Kryptofreak has always been a person given abilities by Kryptonite. Red K affects Clark mentally, but it doesn't give him additional abilities unless you consider having fewer inhibitions a superpower. We've got one instance of Clark being affected by red Kryptonite. We've got one character who's not himself, that's of course Clark. We've got one love triangle with Clark, Jesse, and Lana. We've got three instances of people walking away from each other angry. One is Clark riding his motorcycle away from his parents when they disapprove of his using their credit cards to buy lots of stuff. We have Lana in the bar when Clark wants to date her and Jesse at the same time, though she's totally justified in that one. And then at the end, Lana rides a horse away from Clark after a tense conversation, once again ending with his saying he can't tell her the truth and her rolling her eyes. This one almost doesn't count also the way it plays with her ending the conversation asking if he can find his way back home, but I'm going to count it anyway. We have one instance of Clark being affected by green kryptonite. We have one instance of bullet time. It might actually be slow motion, but it sure looks like bullet time to me when Jonathan hits Clark's ring with his sledgehammer. And we have one bad guy death. That's the federal marshal who gets killed in a confrontation with Clark, but by Jesse's father. I'm going to give Red a 3.5 out of 4. It's got its silly plot contrivances, but the red K is actually used to further develop Clark's character. Jonathan and Lex are both magnificent in this episode, and it explores an idea rather than just stringing scenes together of a main character acting out of character. Was there anything I missed in any category? Leave me a personal message on Geekvolution, and I'll be sure to add it to the count. I'm Captain Logan, and consider this episode counted.